The untouchable warrior. The Valkyrie were untouchable, not because of their strength, not because of their weapons, but because of their gravity shields. Their bodies were surrounded by a personal gravitational field, bending physics to their will. No enemy could land a hit. No force could break through. And among them, Syra was the greatest, a warrior of absolute precision, a legend, and she had never been defeated, until now. The mission, a simple hunt. Syra had been sent on a routine mission to capture or eliminate a human commander named Ryland Graves. The humans had been troublesome lately, resisting the Valkyrie expansion across the stars. But they were still inferior, slower, weaker, predictable. Or so she thought. Her ship landed on Outpost 17, a human-controlled colony at the edge of the war zone. Her armor hummed as her gravity shield activated. She walked fearlessly through the battlefield, bullets and laser fire bending away from her body. The human soldiers were useless. They panicked, unable to touch her. They had never faced a Valkyrie before, and they never would again. She moved like a shadow, cutting through the ranks, untouchable as always. But then, she heard a voice, calm, steady, unshaken. "You're not as special as you think you are." She turned, and there he was, Commander Ryland Graves. The first clash. Ryland didn't run. That was unexpected. Most humans either begged or died quickly. But this one, he just stood there, smirking. Syra narrowed her golden eyes. "You should be afraid." Ryland tilted his head. "Of what?" Syra moved in an instant, faster than human eyes could follow. Her blade slashed forward, aimed for his throat. But then, something happened. Her blade stopped midair, not because of her gravity shield, not because of armor, because he caught her wrist. He touched her. Impossible. Syra staggered back, eyes wide. No one had ever been able to do that before. Ryland just smiled. "Looks like your fancy shield doesn't work on me." The unthinkable defeat. Syra lunged again, her mind racing. She adjusted her gravitational field, increasing the force so that he shouldn't even be able to move. But he did, effortlessly. He sidestepped her next attack, countering faster than any human should be able to. His movements were precise, too precise, like he knew exactly how her power worked. She gritted her teeth. This was wrong. This was impossible. But before she could react, he struck. Not with brute strength, not with desperation, but with perfect timing. His fist landed against her stomach, sending a shock through her entire system. Her gravity field collapsed. For the first time in her life, Syra stumbled. The warrior falls. She gasped, feeling real pain for the first time. She had never felt this weak, never felt this exposed. She tried to recover, to raise her shield again, but Ryland was already behind her. A sharp pain hit the back of her neck, and everything went black. Captured by a human. When Syra woke up, she was in a containment cell. Her armor was gone. Her weapons were missing. And worst of all, her power was blocked. She tried to move, but her body felt heavy. Her gravity field was offline. The realization hit her like a shockwave. She was helpless. A voice echoed from the other side of the cell. "Morning, Princess." Syra's head snapped up. There he was, Commander Ryland Graves, standing outside her cell, arms crossed, smirking. She glared. "I will kill you for this," she hissed. Ryland shrugged. "Maybe." He leaned in slightly, his eyes studying her like a puzzle he had already solved. "But first, I think I'll enjoy watching you figure out something new." Syra's jaw clenched. "And what is that?" she spat. Ryland's smirk widened. "That for the first time in your life, you're not in control." Cliffhanger. The game has changed. Syra had been trained for every scenario, every enemy. every possible threat. But this was something different. For the first time, she wasn't the predator. She was the prey. And the worst part, she didn't know how to fight it. Her fists clenched. Her mind screamed at her to attack, to escape, to regain control. But all she could do was sit there, trapped, helpless, and completely at the mercy of a human. The impossible human. Syra had never known defeat. Not once. Not in training. Not in battle. Not in her entire life. But now she sat trapped in a human cell, her body stripped of power, her mind racing with impossible questions. How had a human beaten her? How had he touched her? How had he stopped her gravity shield like it was nothing? And why? Why was he just sitting there, smirking at her? The game of control. Commander Ryland Graves leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his expression calm, confident, infuriating. "You're still thinking about it, aren't you?" Syra's golden eyes snapped up. "You are beneath me," she said coldly. Ryland chuckled. "Right. That's why you're the one locked up." Syra clenched her fists. She had been taught that humans were weak, that they were slow, emotional, predictable. But this man, this Ryland Graves, he was none of those things. He had read her movements, anticipated her attacks, and worst of all, he had done it without fear. Syra had seen the way humans looked at her kind. Terror, hopelessness, the knowledge that they could never win. But Ryland, he had looked at her and laughed. The escape attempt. Syra's mind worked fast. She needed to regain control. Ryland had disarmed her, but he had made one mistake. He underestimated her. Even without her gravity field, she was still faster, stronger, deadlier than any human alive. She just needed one opening. She forced her body to relax, leaning back against the cell wall. She had seen how humans worked. They were too trusting, too casual. If she played into their emotions, maybe. The force field around her cell deactivated. Her instincts exploded. She moved instantly, a blur of motion, launching toward Ryland with the intent to end this farce immediately. One strike. One perfectly aimed hit to his throat. And he caught her wrist again. Her heart stopped. For the second time, he had touched her. For the second time, he had anticipated her perfectly. But this time, it was worse. Because he didn't just block her. He turned her momentum against her. With a single shift of his stance, he redirected her force. And Syra slammed into the floor. Hard. The moment she lost again. Silence. Syra did not move. She couldn't. Because for the first time in her life, her mind was blank. She had lost. Twice. To the same human. It was impossible. Her muscles burned with fury. Her pride screamed. But her body would not obey her. Ryland crouched beside her, watching her reaction. "You were expecting to catch me off guard, huh?" he said, voice annoyingly amused. Syra glared at him, her breath uneven. "How are you doing this?" she hissed. Ryland tapped the side of his head. "You think too much like a warrior." Syra narrowed her eyes. "And what are you?" His smirk deepened. "A tactician." The shift in power. Ryland stood up, stepping back just enough to let Syra sit up. She should have attacked again. She should have kept fighting. But she didn't. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure she could win. And that feeling, that terrified her. Her hands shook, not from weakness, but from something worse. Uncertainty. Syra was Valkyrie, a species bred for absolute dominance. And yet, sitting here, she had never felt more powerless. She had spent her entire life believing she was untouchable. But now she knew the truth. She had simply never met the right opponent. And this human, this Ryland Graves, had changed everything. Cliffhanger. The breaking point. Ryland turned to leave, pausing at the doorway. "You're not invincible, Zyra," he said without looking back. She remained silent, not because she didn't want to respond, but because she didn't know how. Then he chuckled. "Funny thing is, I don't think that's what scares you the most." Zyra tensed. He looked over his shoulder, meeting her gaze one last time. "I think what really scares you is that part of you likes this." And then he walked out, leaving Zyra alone, trapped not just in a cell, but in her own thoughts. The prisoner who was never trapped. A cold metal floor of her cell, her back against the wall, her mind raging. She had faced hundreds of enemies before. She had destroyed entire squads without breaking a sweat. And yet, one impossible human had taken everything she thought she knew and shattered it. She clenched her fists, jaw tightening. Ryland Graves had done something no one else ever had. He had defeated her. Twice. And what infuriated her the most? She had no idea how. The observation. Days passed. Zyra was still a prisoner, but she was beginning to realize something. She wasn't being treated like one. Her cell was never fully locked. No chains, no mind suppression tech, just a simple energy barrier, one she could probably disable if she had the time. And every day, Ryland came back, not to interrogate, not to threaten, but to talk, to watch her, to study her. Zyra hated it, hated the way he acted so casual, like this was all just a game to him. And worst of all, she was starting to play along. The mind games begin on the 5th day. Zyra finally spoke first. She hated that she was the first to break the silence. But she had to know. "You don't fight like a human," she said. Ryland glanced up from his datapad. That's supposed to be an insult or a compliment. Zyra narrowed her eyes. An observation. Ryland smirked. "Then you've been observing me." Zyra's grip tightened. He was baiting her, and she had fallen for it. She exhaled sharply, leaning forward. "No human has ever countered a Valkyrie warrior in direct combat. And yet you didn't just stop me. You anticipated me." She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "How?" Ryland closed his datapad, his smirk fading into something calculating. "You're predictable," he said simply. Zyra froze. Predictable. Her. The most advanced warrior of her species. She scoffed. "Impossible." Ryland raised an eyebrow. "Is it?" He leaned forward, mirroring her position. "Your kind has been winning battles for centuries. No challenge. No resistance. You've never had to adapt." His eyes locked onto hers, sharp and focused. "But humans? We're weak, slow, breakable. We've spent our entire history losing, and that means we've spent our entire history learning." Zyra's heart pounded. She didn't like this. Didn't like the way his words made sense. Didn't like how she was actually listening. Didn't like how, for the first time in her life, she felt small. She growled, standing up. "You're wrong." Ryland shrugged. "Am I?" She turned away, fists clenched. "You caught me off guard. That's all. It won't happen again." Ryland chuckled. "Then why are you still here?" Zyra's breath hitched. And then, her mind snapped. Because he was right. She could have escaped by now. She could have taken a guard's weapon, found a ship, broken free. But she hadn't. She was still here. Still listening. Still learning. The first shift. That night, Zyra didn't sleep. Her mind was filled with one thought. Was she truly predictable? She had always believed she was superior, that Valkyrie warriors were flawless in battle. But what if? What if she had never actually been tested? What if Ryland wasn't just a human anomaly? What if he was right? What if she had never had to evolve before? Her fists clenched. She had two choices. She could ignore this, convince herself this was just an accident, or she could find out the truth. She sat up, Exhaling slowly, her decision was made. Tomorrow, she was going to fight him again. Not to win, not to prove herself, but to see how far she could go. Because for the first time in her life, Xyra wasn't fighting for her empire. She was fighting for herself. Cliffhanger. The next battle. The next morning, Rylan entered the cell with his usual smirk. Ready for another lecture, he teased. Xyra stepped forward. Fight me. Rylan blinked. What? She crossed her arms. You beat me twice. You claim you understand me. Prove it. Rylan tilted his head. And what do I get if I win again? Xyra's lips curled into the smallest smirk. If you win, I'll answer one question. Truthfully. Rylan's eyes lit up. Now this was interesting. He grinned. All right, warrior princess. He cracked his knuckles. Let's see what you've learned. Xyra exhaled. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't even about control. This was about discovery. And deep down, in a place she would never admit, she was excited. For the first time in her life, she had no idea what would happen next. And for once, she liked it. The fight that changed everything. Xyra had never fought like this before. No armor, no weapons, no gravity shield. Just her instincts, her body, her mind, and the human standing across from her, Rylan Graves. She had given him a challenge. Fight me again. No tricks, no technology, just skill. And now here they were. The moment felt dangerous, not because she feared losing, but because she wanted to know what it felt like to win against him. Not for her empire, not for her honor, but for herself. For the first time in her life, Xyra wanted to prove something. To him, and to herself. The first move. They circled each other in the training chamber. Rylan's stance was relaxed, loose. Xyra knew better. That wasn't weakness. That was control. He was baiting her, testing her. So she did something unexpected. She didn't attack first. She waited. Rylan raised an eyebrow. Learning patience, I see. Xyra smirked. You talk too much. Rylan chuckled. Let's fix that then. And then, he moved. Fast, precise, calculated. Xyra dodged. Barely. She recognized the attack pattern instantly. It was one of her own. She grit her teeth. He really had been studying her. This wasn't just a fight. This was a game of adaptation. And for the first time, Xyra wasn't just playing. She was enjoying it. The counterattack. Rylan swung again, but this time, Xyra anticipated it. She ducked, pivoted, and struck back. Her fist connected. A clean hit. Rylan staggered back, wiping his jaw. And then, he grinned. Finally, he muttered. Xyra narrowed her eyes. Finally. Rylan smirked. You're thinking like me now. Something in her chest heightened. She wasn't sure if it was anger or excitement. Because he was right. She wasn't just fighting like a Valkyrie anymore. She was fighting like a human. Unpredictable, adaptable, free. And she loved it. The breaking point. Xyra's attacks became sharper, more precise, more unlike anything she had ever fought with before. For the first time, she wasn't relying on superior strength or advanced technology. She was relying on something more dangerous. Instinct. Rylan blocked her next strike, but she was already moving before he countered. She ducked under his arm and swept his legs out from under him. For the first time ever, Rylan Graves hit the ground. Xyra pinned him instantly, her hand on his chest, her knee pressing against his side, her breath hot. His eyes locked onto hers. Silence. The energy between them shifted. Neither moved. Neither spoke. And then, Rylan smiled. Now that's interesting, he murmured. Xyra hated that her pulse jumped at his words. She hated how this felt different. How it felt good. She had beaten him. So why did she feel like she had just lost something else? The moment she couldn't ignore. Cyrus slowly stood up, stepping back. Ryland sat up, still smirking. You're thinking about it, aren't you? Cyrus scowled. Thinking about what? He tilted his head. About what you are now. She froze. Because he was right. She wasn't just a Valkyrie warrior anymore. She wasn't just anything anymore. She had changed. And Ryland knew it. She turned sharply. This conversation is over. She walked away. But her thoughts followed her. Because no matter how much she tried to ignore it, for the first time in her life, Shira had no idea who she was anymore. And worst of all, she wasn't sure she wanted to go back. Cliffhanger. The war inside her. Ryland watched her leave, a knowing look in his eyes. She had changed. And now, she had to choose. Would she return to the Valkyrie way, cold, calculated, in control? Or would she embrace the chaos of humanity, where strength wasn't about power, but about choice? And for the first time, she wasn't sure which path was hers. But she knew one thing. This human had done something no enemy ever had. He had gotten inside her head. And that was more dangerous than any battle she had ever fought. The war inside her. Syra had always believed in control. Control over her body. Control over her power. Control over her mind. But now, for the first time, she felt unstable. Not because she was defeated. Not because she had lost power. But because she didn't know who she was anymore. The questions she couldn't escape. She sat alone in her cell, staring at the wall. She could hear Ryland's words echoing in her head. You're thinking about it, aren't you? She hated that he was right. Hated that she was thinking about it. Hated that her mind kept going back to the fight. The way he moved. The way he anticipated her. The way he forced her to adapt. And worst of all, the way she had liked it. She had never been challenged like that before. Never had to evolve in battle. Never had to fight for something beyond her empire. So why? Why did she want to do it again? The arrival of the Valkyrie High Command. Before she could answer that question, the choice was taken from her. Because the Valkyrie Empire had arrived. Alarms blared across the human base. Ships tore through the sky, their black hulls blocking out the stars. The High Command had come for her. Not to rescue her. Not to negotiate. But to correct her. To erase whatever was happening to her. And this time, they wouldn't fail. Ryland's warning. The doors to her cell slammed open. Raylan stormed inside, eyes sharp. They're here for you. Zyra's pulse spiked, but she kept her voice calm. Of course they are. Ryland leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. You have two choices, princess. His voice was steady, too steady. You go back with them, and they wipe whatever's happening to you ****. Zyra clenched her jaw. And if I refuse? Ryland's smirk returned. Then you fight them. With us. Zyra stared at him. Fight with humans. Betray her own people. The idea was unthinkable. But then, she thought about what would happen if she went back. They wouldn't just erase this. They would erase her. Who she had become. Who she was becoming. Everything she had learned from Ryland. Her fists clenched. She wasn't ready to lose that. Not yet. Maybe. Not ever. The High Commander's ultimatum. Minutes later, she stood on the landing platform, staring up at the Valkyrie flagship. A massive figure descended. High Commander Varys. A legend. A warrior. The one who had trained her since childhood. And now, the one who had come to erase her. His eyes burned as they locked onto hers. You have been corrupted, Zyra. His voice was cold. Absolute. Final. You will return. You will be cleansed. And you will forget all of this. Zyra felt the weight of the moment. Her past. Her future. everything hanging in the balance. Rylan stepped beside her, arms crossed. "You see, that's the problem," he said, smirking. "She's not as easy to control anymore." Zyra's breath hitched, because he was right. And for the first time in her life, she didn't want to be controlled. She wanted to choose. She took a slow breath, met her commander's gaze, and then she spoke. Cliffhanger, the point of no return. "I'm not going back." The words tore through the air like a blade. The High Commander's face darkened. "You are making a mistake," he growled. Zyra stood firm. "No," she said. "For the first time in my life, I am not." A long silence. Then, the order was given. The Valkyrie warriors drew their weapons. The human soldiers raised their rifles. The war had begun. And Zyra, she had just chosen her side. The betrayal that changed everything. The moment she chose, the war began. Zyra stood beside the humans, her back straight, her fists clenched. Across from her, the Valkyrie High Commander, Varys, stood with his warriors, his loyal warriors. They had never questioned orders. They had never doubted their path, just as she once had. But now they saw her as the enemy. And the moment she saw their weapons raise, she knew there was no turning back. The first strike. The Valkyrie warriors moved first. Fast, precise, lethal. They descended like shadows, their gravity shields bending reality around them. Human soldiers fired back, but their bullets curved away, missing their targets. Zyra saw the mistake immediately. These humans were fighting the Valkyrie like normal enemies, but Valkyrie were never normal. She gritted her teeth. If the humans fought this way, they would lose. She had no choice. She launched herself forward, faster than any human, faster than her own kind expected. And when the first Valkyrie warrior swung at Rylan, she intercepted the attack against her own people. The shock of betrayal. The entire battlefield froze. For a brief moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Zyra stood in front of Rylan, her arm locked against her former comrade's blade. She had blocked it. Not an accident. Not hesitation. A choice. A betrayal. She heard Varys' voice through the silence. Cold. Final. "You would strike your own kin." Zyra did not flinch. She pushed the warrior's blade away, stepping forward. And she said the words that sealed her fate. "I choose my own path." Varys' eyes burned with fury. And then, the Valkyrie attacked her. The warrior becomes the prey. Zyra had always been the hunter, always the unstoppable force. Now she was the target. Her own people rushed at her with the full force of their deadly skill. She dodged, blocked, countered. But it wasn't just a fight. It was a test to see if she was still one of them. And when she didn't submit, when she didn't fall in line, the attacks became real, lethal. Her own people wanted her dead. And that's when she knew. She was no longer Valkyrie. Not to them. Not anymore. Rylan's gamble. Rylan watched in horror. The Valkyrie weren't just fighting her. They were trying to erase her. He saw the moment she hesitated. The split second where she could have killed one of her own. And didn't. She still cared. And that was going to get her killed. Rylan made a choice. He charged into the fight. No weapons. No armor. Just one mission. Get to Zyra before it was too late. The breaking point. Zyra was fast. But they were faster together. Her movements slowed. Her body burned from exhaustion. Her people were relentless. And then, one of them struck her across the chest. Her body flew backward, crashing into the ground. Pain shot through her, and when she looked up, she saw Varys standing over her. This is what happens to those who forget who they are. His blade rose. This was it. Her own people were going to kill her. But before the strike could land, a hand grabbed her wrist and yanked her away. Rylan. She barely had time to react before he dragged her to safety, dodging blasts of energy and gunfire. "Come on, princess," he shouted. And for once, she didn't argue. She ran. Not from fear, not from weakness, but because she wanted to live. She wanted to see where this path led. She wanted to know what came next. The price of freedom. They barely made it to the extraction point. The human fleet pulled them in, the doors sealing behind them. Kazira collapsed onto the floor, breathing hard. Her chest ached, not from the fight, but from what she had just done. She had crossed the line. There was no going back. And as she turned to face Rylan, she saw something she never expected. Him, reaching for her, not as a captor, not as an enemy, but as an equal. "You all right?" Her breath caught in her throat. For the first time in her life, she had no answer. And for once, she was okay with that. The price of freedom. Tyra sat in the dimly lit warship, staring at her own reflection in the steel wall. She was alive. But for the first time in her life, she didn't know who she was. The Valkyrie had disowned her. Her people would never take her back. She had fought against them. For what? For humans. For Rylan. Her mind screamed that she had made a mistake. But her heart told her she had never been more free. And that was the part that scared her the most. The last conversation. Rylan leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching her in silence. "You okay, princess?" Zyra's jaw clenched. "You don't have to keep calling me that." Rylan smirked. "Habit." She exhaled sharply, turning to face him. "You don't understand what I've done." Rylan raised an eyebrow. "Enlighten me." Zyra's fingers tightened into fists. "My people don't tolerate betrayal. There is no exile, no forgiveness. The moment I stood against them, I became a ghost." Rylan interrupted. Zyra's throat tightened. She hated that word, because it was true. She wasn't Valkyrie anymore, but she wasn't human either. She was something in between. A warrior without a war. A soldier without a home. She should have felt lost. But instead, she just felt free. The final choice. Rylan watched her closely. "You regret it." Zyra hesitated. Her mind told her to say yes. To pretend she wanted her old life back. To act like this was just a temporary mistake. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she looked at Rylan and asked, "What now?" Rylan smirked. "Now, you decide." Zyra blinked. "Decide." Rylan nodded. "You spent your whole life following orders, fighting for someone else's cause. You ever fought for yourself?" Silence. Zyra's chest tightened. She had never fought for herself. Never even thought about what she wanted. For the first time, she had a choice. And it terrified her, because she had no idea what she wanted. But maybe she wanted to find out. The High Command's last move. Far across the galaxy, in the heart of the Valkyrie Empire, High Commander Varys stood before the Supreme Council. His voice was calm, cold, absolute. "She has fallen." The council sat in silence. Their best warrior, their greatest soldier, their perfect Valkyrie, gone. A mistake that could never be undone. The Supreme Chancellor leaned forward. "Then erase her." Varys' golden eyes burned. "It will be done." And just like that, Zyra became the most hunted person in the galaxy. The beginning of something greater. Back on the human warship, Zyra stood beside Rylan, watching the stars. She didn't know where she belonged. Didn't know what came next. But for once, she wasn't afraid to find out. Rylan nudged her shoulder. "You ever thought about what freedom actually feels like?" Zyra tilted her head. "No." Rylan grinned. "Guess you're about to." And with that, the ship jumped into hyperspace, leaving behind the war. leaving behind the past and heading toward something completely unknown. For the first time in her life, Zaira wasn't following orders. She was making her own. The end.